or progress on the springs. I went through and finished grinding down the middle, just a little fraction in here, so that the U-bolts will fit over the springs correctly. And these U-bolts are formed unlike the sort of cast ones that they use on an Austin 7. So on the Austin 7 front spring there are square U-bolts like this, but the corners are sharp. These ones, because of the way they've been formed, the corners are kind of slightly curved. They are actually formed a little bit square, but what I found is if you try to put these on the spring, they'll sort of really dig in to the corner of the spring, and I'm not sure the top was going to sit flat. And I'm pretty sure they're not supposed to be like that. So I machined up these little plates with chamfered edges, and they'll be able to fit on top of the spring like that. And I've shaped them, or sized them rather, so that when the U-bolt goes on, the chamfer misses the corners there. So the U-bolt will clamp very tightly onto the top of these plates, and hopefully that will hold everything really tightly in position, which I think should work okay. I've also, as you can tell, repainted all of this just in the semi-gloss black. I just prefer that finish rather than too glossy. I also went ahead and made up the spacers and fitted these bolts. I didn't bother trying to make them conical in the end, because what I found is these bolts, the heads are fitting into the conical recess in the little bracket anyway, and they sort of sit in there and then dig in, so you don't need two spanners really to do this up tight. These are only there to stop these leaves moving side to side, I guess. Something has to sort of hold them all in place. That's what those are for. The other little job I've done today is I've cleaned up the second-hand differential. This all works really nicely now. This, like most of the stuff on the Riley, this is all really nicely made, really high quality stuff. And you can see the original E&V London casting marks, and it even has that embossed in the bolts. And I'm not sure if we can see it very well, but even on the little lock tabs here, has that actually stamped into it. That sort of, I don't think it'll focus, but these are obviously all original. I probably won't reuse these ones. You can see these have been bent back already, and this one's cracked, so I will have to undo these. I can reuse the bolts, but I can't reuse these washers, so I'll just have to make up new ones of those. In the instructions that actually came with the diff, it does mention lock wiring something, but I'm not sure exactly which bolts it's talking about. It may be these ones around here when the crown wheel's on there, so I need to go back and check my instructions and make sure I understand exactly what's happening. I did make sure all the teeth on this are clean. It was basically sitting in a bath of degreaser for a couple of nights. This is all steel, so that was fine. And then it's been cleaned with brake cleaner, or rather carb cleaner. And then it's just been given a coat of WD-40 from a spray bottle, just so it doesn't rust while I'm still playing with it. Probably before I assemble it, I'll give it another really good rinse out, maybe in some petrol or something, just to make sure it's perfectly clean before I reassemble it. But that's come up well. You do have to make sure this face around here is really nice and clean, because when you assemble all this, you put the new crown wheel on there, and you have to set this up between blocks, between V blocks, and you really want to make sure that when this is rotating in the bearings, there's a minimal amount of run out on that crown wheel. And if it's like other diffs I've done in the past, you may have to play a little bit with the positioning of that wheel around here. Obviously you can sort of rotate it and bolt it down through different holes to minimize that run out. So that'll be interesting when I get to that point. Differentials are always kind of interesting in understanding how they work, and it's sort of easier when you see it outside of the car like this. You have to imagine this one has the crown wheel on it. I'm not actually going to set all that up until I've sorted out the torque tube and shortened that, and then I can actually build up the whole rear axle. So before I can do that, I need to figure out the suspension, which I'll do first. But differentials always used to confuse me in exactly how they work, because if you look at one just sitting here like this, it's not obvious how they can work, because if you imagine the half shafts which connect to the wheels coming in each side of the differential, you can see if it's just sitting here and you turn one of the gears, the other one goes backwards. And you can see this if you jack up the rear of a car with a differential and take the handbrake off, and then rotate one of the rear wheels, the other rear wheel will rotate the opposite direction. So it's kind of hard to see how the differential can have the two shafts going different speeds if turning one gear makes the other gear go backwards. And the way I always think about it and explain it to myself is you have to remember that this whole unit is rotating as well. So this whole thing is also rotating around sort of like that. Oh, it's a bit hard with one hand. And if you think of it like that, it makes it easy. So if you consider this whole assembly as rotating around at, say, 10 revolutions per second, and if this gear is going forwards at 1 revolution per second, this one will go backwards at 1 revolution per second. But you have to add those to the overall rotation. So if this is going forward 10 rotations per second and this one's going forward 1, you add those together. So this shaft will be going 11 rotations per second. This one, you subtract 1. So it will be going, the whole thing goes 10, this is going back 1, so this shaft will actually be going 9 revolutions per second. So that's where the differential part comes into it. It's just really hard to see because you can't see what's happening inside there when this whole assembly is spinning. So I just remember as a kid being really confused at, well, how come one wheel isn't going backwards if one is going forwards? And it's because of that entire relative motion of the whole assembly. Now that I have the new crankshaft, I can start looking at what I need to do to be able to get this to fit into the block there. So this is the old crankshaft. This is an original Riley one. When the engine had all been rebuilt, way before I got it, it had been rebuilt but never run. And this is the crankshaft that was in there. And this has been ground down, I believe. So the wear was ground out of it, and the bearings and everything were re-white metal to fit this crank. Before I fitted it, I had it crack tested, and it was lucky I did, because this crank has a crack in it in here somewhere, which is the number 2 journal. So this can't be used. That would break eventually. So I had to splash out on a new crank, and you can buy these new from the Riley Register Spares in the UK. But if I did that, I would still need to get things re-white metalled. I would have to get the conrods I've got re-white metalled on the big ends to fit the back to normal size crank. So it would have been a bit of fiddling around. What I did instead is decided to invest in a brand new modern crank. So this is an Arrows crank, and you can see it's much beefier than the old original Riley one. And I'm assuming it's going to be better balanced because it's the way it's built with the counterbalancing here. Looks like a really nice crank. So there are differences between these two cranks. It might be a bit hard to see on the video, but basically the journals on here are much bigger, and this crank gets used with new rods that actually use shell bearings. And also the rear of the crank here is much, much fatter, much heavier than the original one. I think this is 1.5 inches and this is 1.625, something like that. So the Riley block is a 2-bearing block and it uses white metal bearings. That's the rear one in there. The front one actually goes on this cover. So this cover gets bolted to the front of the engine there. The reason it's not bolted on at the moment is because I had these cleaned up. These have been vapor blasted, which is why they're so clean. You can see that one's actually cracked. I have to be really careful there because it's almost cracked all the way through. So I do need to just tick that back together and then I can bolt this on. And you can see the front bearing in there, again a white metal bearing. Now the fronts of these crankshafts are almost the same diameter, but the original one here was ground down slightly. So that means this bearing is slightly smaller than normal. And the difference between this bearing size and the new crank size is only about 25 thou. So what I'm hoping is when this is in place and the block, this basically has to be bolted on and then the block has to be line bored to make sure the two bearings are completely parallel. And what I'm hoping is there's enough bearing material on here that it can just be bored out and it doesn't need to be remetaled. The rear, however, is a different story because it's going to be difficult to see, but you can see how this rear bearing, it's actually a sort of brass tube, brass sleeve that's pushed into the block, I guess, and the white metal is inside that. Now there may not be enough meat there to machine that out and remetal it. So in that case what has to happen is the block needs to be bored out, a larger sleeve put in, and the new bearing put into the larger sleeve. It's actually getting rather tricky to find people who can do that, but there is a guy who can do that who is about an hour and a half north of me, so hopefully I'll be going to visit him next week to drop all this stuff off. You can also see the difference in the different cranks, how the crank pinion gear is held on. So I did get a new pinion gear, that's this one. That will fit on there. It'll be a fairly tight push fit. This crank is fresh out of its greasy paper, so it's covered in sticky stuff which needs to be cleaned off. But you can see this pinion gear just slides on there and there's a key. I have the key there. I also have 4 Flywheel crankshaft keys for some reason. I think I keep thinking I need them, and every time I make a parts order, because these are relatively cheap compared to everything else, I always seem to add one to the list. So I've got 4 of them, which is a bit excessive, but that's okay. The old crank had a different style gear. It was more like this, and you can see how this was sort of pushed on and then pinned through. That's what those holes are for. What I have is a Mark V engine though, which is slightly different, and this is where it gets, I've had several of those, this is where it gets a little bit trickier, and I'm going to have to do some modifications, but I've got the instructions on how to do that. I do have the new gear here, that goes on there, and then you have the special left-hand thread pinion nut, which fits on like that. Reverse thread. And what has to happen is, on this engine, the intermediate gear sits here on this pin. This is the eccentric that drives the oil pump. So this kind of just freely rotates on that pin. I can't actually remember what goes on the end here to keep that in place. This is the cover that goes on the end of it all, and you can sort of see how there's that recess there. There must be something that goes between there to kind of hold that on. thrust washer, or this seems to have a keyed end piece for some reason. I'm not sure why or what goes on there. I haven't quite figured it out from the parts book yet, but I'm sure that'll become clear at some point. But if you imagine the crank pinion gear lives down here. Now this is interesting because I expected these to be different widths, but it all seems to be the same width. These teeth are a little bit raggedy on the edges, but that should be okay. So this drives that gear, and then you've got your two camshafts that go in here, and they've each got a gear, so it's all gear driven. So this will go on there, that will mesh with this. Yeah, I'm definitely confused now, because I thought with the Mark V gears they were different widths, but that's interesting, because if we look at one of these, you can see this gear is a different width. So I think what I have here is the vintage style pinion. There's also a thrust washer which goes, I'm not sure where that goes. It either goes there or the other side of the pinion. Hopefully that becomes clear later as well. So as you can see, it's all a weird mismatch of bits and pieces. The important thing though is getting this crank into this block in these bearings and rotating nicely. Once I've done that, then I can figure out exactly how all this front stuff goes. You can actually buy these gears new, and you can buy these pins and things, but I think I actually have all the parts here now to make that work. So we'll see. The other thing worth mentioning is, because this crank is much bigger diameter, it changes the size of the taper, and this taper is what the flywheel attaches to. So you can see here with the old crank, I can lift it up. There's a taper there, and there's a taper on the end of the crankshaft, and those sort of lock together. So because this is a bigger diameter, this taper needs to be opened up. If I put this down, I don't think I can actually do this with one hand because this is so heavy, but you would be able to see let's see if I can do this one-handed. You can see how the new crank, the taper will need to be opened out to make this slide further down onto the crankshaft. Now that's going to be interesting. That's not something I can do myself, obviously. There's no way this would fit on my tiny little lathe behind there. But also, I'm not a good enough engineer to be able to do that accurately. Exactly how we work out how much to take off here, I don't actually know. So that's something I'm going to have to find out when I take this back to the engineering guy. I'm going to have to specify exactly how much this needs to be tapered. So I guess they measure it and then they cut the taper on here to be the same in the same angles. I don't really know. That's specialized stuff that somebody else will have to do for me. And then of course the other thing is, once this is cut and this is on the taper, at least I have enough keys, is this will have to all be balanced. Now I'm sure the crank is balanced as it is. This will have been balanced as made, but the clutch and flywheel won't be. And this also, you can see I've had machined to lighten it Apparently you can even lighten it more than that. So this will need to be balanced, and they'll do all of that as a single assembly. The good thing about needing this flywheel machined again is if you look inside there closely, you can see there's actually a little bit of pitting and corrosion in there from where it was on the old crankshaft. That probably doesn't make much difference once that was all done up tight, but it's nice to know that because I have to have this machined out bigger, that should get rid of all of that pitting, so we'll get a really nice tight fit on between the flywheel and the crankshaft, which is obviously important. So the last thing that I've done today is started bolting together the front axle properly. So I've added the steering arms on either end, and these use special bolts. They're specially machined bolts that go through. They're a very tight fit in there. So I had to reuse the original bolts, and I also had to reuse the original castle nuts. I thought I had some that would fit, that were new, but it turns out they were the wrong size, so I had to clean up the originals. One thing to note when you're putting through bolts like this, which have got a hole for a split pin, is it's very handy to make sure you know where the hole is before you start doing the nut up. And so I was careful on these. These nuts, the bolt heads rather, seem to go up against a little shoulder on the inside of the stub axle there, so they won't turn all the way around. So I'm pretty sure this is the way around they go, and looking at pictures of an original Brooklands, that's the way they are. So I made sure that the split pin holes are near the top, so I can drop the pins through basically from the top. I think it just looks neater if you've got all that sort of stuff lined up. And they're done up to very tight. So I don't know if there's an actual torque figure for them. I doubt there is, but you basically do them up as tight as you can and then tighten them more to get the split pin hole to line up. Sometimes you do need to swap around where the nuts are, or even file a little tiny bit off the bottom of the nut just to get it to go up, just to get the castellations to line up with the hole so you can get the pin through. But those are all very tight. I do use copper grease on everything, even between the mounting surfaces there, just to prevent any sort of corrosion in the future, but I doubt that's going to happen. I also hammered through the cotter pins that hold the kingpins in place, so they're in there nice and tight now. And I went ahead and gave everything a quick blast of my favourite paint there, which is why it looks a bit glossy at the moment, because it hasn't dried. I would also fit the tie rod that goes across, which I do have down here. This is the tie rod here, but when I ordered the last lot of parts, I forgot to order the parts to restore the ball ends that go on the ends of the tie rod. So I'll have to make another order to get those, sort those out, paint them up, and then I can put that in place. And I do have, hopefully, a drag link that goes from here to the steering box for me over in the UK. So that's all good. That's when the paint's dry, that's ready to go back on the car. The springs have been painted and they're all ready to go back on the car, and you can see how I made these little plates, how they work now, just so that the U-bolt is making really good contact with the top of the spring. I very much suspect that I'm going to be replacing these little plates with an actual top leaf at some point. So when I had the springs redone, they sent back the leaves they didn't use, the ones they've taken out. So I've got the original spring steel. So what I can do is trim down one of those. I should just be able to cut it with the angle grinder and grind the ends to be the nice sort of feathered ends. And if these are too saggy, I should be able to put another leaf on the top there, which will stiffen those up. and hopefully that will be enough. If not, I'll have to get these springs sent away again and reset, but that was always a possibility. I think that's it. I completely forgot that I was going to weld up the cracked cover here, so that'll be a job for tomorrow night probably. I was going to mention one last thing, but then I realized my nemesis is back. Don't know if you can see him up in that window there. I'll see if I can zoom in on him. There he is. It's a cat. And he sits up there and he stares at me. My girlfriend thinks I'm imagining it and he's actually looking at the birds, but she hasn't seen the evil intent in his eyes. So I've just realised that window is also terribly filthy. Anyway, I've forgotten what it was I was going to mention. I'm sure it'll come back to me later on. But that's probably enough for tonight.